Cheap money once felt like oxygen, swirling through every corner of modern life effortlessly and invisibly. For decades, interest rates hovered near zero, quietly hypnotizing households, companies, and governments into reckless comfort. Mortgages stretched larger, car loans multiplied, credit cards bloomed, and corporate debt soared without hesitation anywhere. Everyone borrowed because borrowing felt harmless, and everyone believed the cheap era would last forever. But history never allows a free lunch, and cheap money is the most deceptive illusion imaginable. It convinces nations they are richer than they are, and convinces families stability is guaranteed. Yet, beneath that calm surface sits explosive leverage, quietly accumulating until one shock breaks everything suddenly. The turning point always arrives quietly at first, then violently all at once without warning for anyone. Today the world stands at such a turning point, blinking as interest rates rise rapidly worldwide everywhere. For the first time in a generation, humanity must learn how expensive money changes everything quickly. What follows is not just economics. It is psychology, history, geopolitics, and survival disguised as finance. Because when interest rates rise sharply, nations bleed confidence and families bleed options almost immediately, without mercy. To understand why cheap money mattered so much, start with the basic physics of finance anywhere. Interest is not simply a percentage. It is the price of time, risk, and trust. Low interest means the future feels reliable, stable, and safe enough to borrow against comfortably and confidently. High interest means the future feels uncertain, dangerous, and costly, turning every decision into a calculation again. For 40 years, the world drifted under falling rates, from the 1980s peak through 2020's pandemic lows. Nations built budgets assuming borrowing remained cheap. Companies engineered strategies around leverage. Households trusted credit endlessly. The result was a global economic architecture resting entirely on the assumption that money stays inexpensive indefinitely. But money is only cheap when inflation sleeps, political calm exists, and global trust remains unbroken everywhere. When those pillars crack, central banks do the only thing they can: raise interest rates decisively. Raising rates is not a punishment. It is a weapon against inflation that erodes savings and wages. The pain comes when societies forget this pattern, building lifestyles and policies on illusions of endless liquidity. And that is exactly where the modern world now stands, comfortable, over-leveraged, and dangerously unprepared collectively. For households, cheap money shaped the rhythm of life so thoroughly it became invisible by habit. Debt became not a burden but a tool, and then a lifestyle, and then an expectation universally. Overnight, mortgages doubled, credit lines shrank, adjustable loans spiked. And monthly budgets cracked under pressure. Suddenly cheap money was not a memory. It was a trap closing around millions unprepared, instantly. Companies that had rolled debt cheaply for a decade woke up, facing refinancing costs gutting entire balance sheets. Zombie firms, businesses living solely on cheap credit, began collapsing when rates became lethal pressures. Commercial real estate, addicted to low rates and rising valuations, now faced refinancing cliffs of destruction. Banks holding long-term bonds at low yields watched losses balloon as interest rates rose aggressively worldwide. Governments too discovered how fragile their budgets were when borrowing no longer cost almost nothing. Nations carrying huge debts, the United States, Japan, Italy, the UK, China, felt pressure mounting rapidly. Interest payments devoured larger portions of tax revenue, turning future spending plans into fiscal nightmares quickly. Public services strained, political tensions rose, and debates erupted over austerity, taxes, and national solvency suddenly. What makes rising interest rates especially dangerous is their ability to create silent crashes before visible ones. Families collapse quietly when mortgage resets hit. Companies collapse quietly when refinancing windows tighten drastically. Governments collapse quietly when bond markets lose confidence. Banks collapse quietly when depositors sense weakness. The visible crash happens last, long after internal fractures have already destabilized the entire system silently. And that is why today's rising rate era feels so volatile, because silent fractures multiply everywhere simultaneously. Household debt hits records, corporate debt sets new highs, government deficits explode, and global refinancing surges. The world built during the low-rate era is incompatible with the high-rate world replacing it now. And no institution, company, or country can escape the consequences when the cost of money changes dramatically. But here's the deeper truth the public rarely hears. Interest rates don't just shape economies, they choose winners. When money gets expensive, only those with cash survive. Only those with assets thrive meaningfully. Cheap money creates middle classes. Expensive money destroys them, redistributing wealth upward, systematically and invisibly. This pattern has repeated for centuries every time interest rate cycles snap violently back to reality. During low-rate eras, people with jobs, mortgages, and small savings can build stable futures gradually. But during high-rate eras, Wealth migrates to those who already hold assets that appreciate under scarcity. Landlords gain leverage. Bondholders gain yield. Cash-rich investors buy distressed property from struggling households cheaply. The wealthy treat high rates as opportunity. The poor treat high rates as punishment, without alternatives. Even nations experience this hierarchy because countries with strong currencies survive high-rate cycles relatively intact. Nations with weak currencies drown immediately, crushed by dollar-denominated debts as interest burdens multiply sharply. We saw this in Latin America in the 1980s, Asia in the 1990s, Europe in the 2010s, repeatedly. High American interest rates act like a financial gravity pulling weaker economies toward crisis almost inevitably. Today, that gravity is visible again as emerging markets struggle with surging debt payments and capital flight. Countries heavily reliant on cheap loans now face harsh winters of renegotiations, defaults, and political upheaval. The global system, built on dollar liquidity, suffers when the dollar strengthens and borrowing costs explode globally. And yet, this cycle continues because every economic boom plants the seeds of the next rate shock. When interest rates rise sharply, the world does not collapse in one dramatic, televised moment. It collapses through thousands of private failures, quiet defaults, and invisible fractures accumulating daily everywhere. The news reports only the explosions, but the real damage always begins months earlier, silently. That is why rising rate eras feel confusing to the public. Suffering appears slowly, then suddenly unstoppable. Families begin cutting essentials before they ever admit they are drowning under rising borrowing costs. They delay dentist visits, skip car repairs, stretch groceries, and hide late notices from kitchen tables. Budgets break long before bankruptcies appear because high interest turns every choice painfully unforgiving quickly. Cheap money forgives mistakes. Expensive money punishes them mercilessly, especially for those already living precariously. Small businesses feel the shift next because rising interest hits their margins faster than households realize. Credit lines shrink, inventory financing costs balloon, suppliers demand faster payments, and customers begin hesitating purchases. A shop that survived years on thin margins suddenly becomes impossible when debt service doubles overnight. You don't read about these closures immediately. They die one invoice, one delay, one rate hike at time. Then comes the corporate phase, where refinancing windows slam shut for heavily leveraged companies rapidly everywhere. For a decade, they issued cheap bonds, rolled cheap loans, and trusted cheap money eternally. Now, maturities arrive like landmines buried across corporate balance sheets, detonating when refinancing becomes unaffordable. We call these credit events, but they are simply businesses suffocating under the price of time. Private equity firms face the harshest reality of all because their entire model depends on leverage. They bought companies using debt, cut costs, extracted dividends, and refinanced repeatedly under low-rate conditions. Now, they must refinance at punishing rates, forcing fire sales, layoffs, and brutal restructurings everywhere. Some firms profit from chaos. Others drown in it, exposing how cheap money inflated false valuations previously. Commercial real estate becomes the next casualty because office towers and malls depend on constant refinancing cycles. Buildings financed at 3% cannot survive refinancing at 8% without catastrophic valuation drops. Vacancies rise, loans sour, landlords default, and banks nervously watch collateral values collapse shockingly fast. This is how rising interest rates create slow-moving earthquakes that shake cities silently before buildings fall. The banking system then enters the battlefield because banks hold long-term assets vulnerable to rate shocks. When rates rise, bond portfolios lose value, depositors panic, and liquidity evaporates with frightening speed. We saw this brutally in 2023, when regional banks collapsed almost overnight from duration mismatches. Those failures were not anomalies. They were warnings of how fragile cheap money banks had become. Governments face their reckoning next because high interest rates inflate deficits far faster than voters realize. When trillions must be refinanced at higher rates, interest consumes budgets like wildfire, consuming forests. Money once reserved for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and public safety gets redirected toward bondholders silently. This is how high interest reshapes nations, not with riots initially, but with shrinking futures gradually. Soon, political tension rises because rising rates expose every lie politicians told during the era of cheap credit. Promises made with borrowed money unravel once borrowing becomes expensive, forcing choices nobody wants confronting. Taxes climb, benefits shrink, and voters learn painful truth. Low rates were masking structural weakness everywhere. Anger rises, trust falls, and political extremism thrives wherever economic oxygen begins disappearing most rapidly. History warns us repeatedly that rising interest rates break not only economies but political orders themselves. The Weimar crisis began with cheap credit collapse. Latin American dictatorships rose after rate shocks decades later. The Asian financial crisis triggered leadership falls. Greece's crisis rewrote politics entirely within a few years. High interest creates instability because societies built on debt cannot breathe when borrowing becomes suffocating. Yet, amid destruction, there are always winners. Those who understand rising rate eras create rare windows for opportunity. Cash becomes king, not because cash grows, but because everything else collapses faster under tightening liquidity. Assets fall to distressed prices, allowing buyers with dry powder to acquire property, companies, and land cheaply. These cycles produce new elites, new fortunes, new dynasties built on the ruins of leveraged eras. Bondholders with floating yields gain power, collecting higher interest from governments and companies struggling severely. Savers regain dignity as interest finally rewards discipline instead of punishing caution relentlessly for decades. Investors with patience and cash accumulate bargains unavailable during cheap money booms, harvesting future prosperity early. Rising rate eras punish debtors but reward those prepared, turning crisis into a ladder instead of a cliff. But there is an even deeper lesson here, one hidden beneath centuries of monetary cycles everywhere, repeatedly. Cheap money inflates illusions of competence. Expensive money exposes who actually understands economic survival genuinely. Cheap money amplifies luck. Expensive money amplifies skill, prudence, resilience, and strategic foresight profoundly. This is why rising rate eras reshuffle societies, elevating some, humiliating others, and transforming generations endlessly. Families who survive high-rate eras typically share specific habits that look boring during cheap money cycles. They avoid adjustable-rate loans, keep emergency savings, spend below means, and distrust easy credit instinctively. They prioritize earning power and skills over lifestyle inflation, understanding real security comes from productivity. They build their lives on fundamentals rather than speculation, remaining stable while others chase financial mirages blindly. Nations that survive rising rate eras also share predictable patterns deeply rooted in historical experience everywhere. They hold foreign reserves, maintain conservative fiscal policies, regulate banks tightly, and avoid reckless foreign borrowing. They invest in productivity, innovation, infrastructure, and workforce quality, not temporary growth driven by borrowing. Strong institutions and long-term planning act as insulation when global monetary storms arrive with destructive force. The nations that fall share opposite traits: high foreign debt, weak currencies, political instability, and fragile banks. Their budgets depend on borrowing, their imports depend on credit, their currencies depend on external confidence. Rising interest rates expose these vulnerabilities, triggering panics, capital flight, and rapid currency devaluations. In these places, rising rates don't just hurt. They collapse living standards and rewrite history brutally. The world today is entering a high-rate era with unprecedented structural vulnerabilities on all levels globally. Household debt has never been higher. Corporate leverage has never been greater. Government deficits have exploded. The global economy requires low interest rates to function smoothly, yet inflation prevents returning to them. This is the dangerous paradox. We built a world that cannot survive the medicine it now requires. The next decade will reveal which systems adapt and which systems break under sustained high-rate pressure everywhere. Some nations will restructure debts, renegotiate obligations, and swallow political pain to regain monetary stability. Others will deny reality until collapse arrives brutally, forcing emergency assistance from IMF with harsh conditions. Households will split into two groups, those who adjust in time and those crushed inevitably. The end of cheap money is not doom, but it is a reset, a rebalancing of illusions. It forces a return to fundamentals: cash flow, solvency, discipline, productivity, and genuine economic value. It punishes speculation and rewards patience, punishes leverage and rewards liquidity, punishes noise and rewards knowledge. This is the cycle repeating across centuries, shaping empire, markets, families, and futures without mercy. The question is no longer whether the era of cheap money has ended. It unquestionably has already. The question is how individuals and nations respond, now that debt can finally inflict pain again. History shows those who survive rising rate eras are the ones who adapt earliest and fastest decisively. Because when the price of money rises, the cost of waiting becomes catastrophic for almost everyone. So look closely at what rising rates reveal: who borrowed recklessly, who saved patiently, who prepared wisely. Interest rates are not numbers on screen. They are civilization's report card, exposing collective decisions brutally. Cheap money hides mistakes. Expensive money exposes them publicly. The difference between eras is unforgiving. And in this new era, survival belongs not to the confident, but to the cautious and prepared. If this story gave you a new way to see money, economics, and history more clearly, subscribe, because the next episodes will explore where these monetary tremors lead and who endures.